The scorching summer of 1526, somewhere on the Hungarian flatlands near a place called Mohács, a king barely old enough to grow a beard is about to gamble everything on one roll of the dice. In the next 120 minutes, the entire destiny of Central Europe will be rewritten in blood and gunpowder. What happens here won't just decide a battle, it will slam the door shut on an entire era of history. This isn't your typical war story. This is the moment when knights in shining armor charged headlong into the future and got absolutely obliterated. When the proud kingdom of Hungary collided with the Ottoman Empire at the peak of its power. When a 20-year-old ruler named Louis II stood face-to-face with Suleiman the Magnificent, the most dangerous man alive. The result? A massacre so swift, so total, that Hungary would never stand on its own 2 feet again. But here's the thing, the real tragedy of Mohács wasn't decided on the battlefield. It was sealed months before by betrayal, political games, and decisions so catastrophically stupid they'd be funny if they weren't so deadly. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into one of history's most brutal lessons. Sometimes the old ways don't just lose, they get erased from existence. Let's rewind to 1525, because the seeds of Hungary's destruction were planted in the most unlikely place, the royal court of France. King Francis I of France had a problem. He was locked in a bitter rivalry with Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he was losing. So Francis did something that shocked every Christian ruler in Europe. He made a deal with the devil. Well, not literally the devil, but the next best thing in the eyes of European Christians. Sultan Suleiman of the Ottoman Empire. This alliance wasn't some diplomatic handshake. It was a calculated backstab of epic proportions. Francis essentially told Suleiman, hey, you want to attack the Holy Roman Empire? Go right ahead, crush them for me. There was just one tiny problem with this plan. Hungary was directly in the path between the Ottoman Empire and Charles V's territories. The Magyars were about to become collateral damage in someone else's war. For Sultan Suleiman, Francis's invitation was like Christmas morning. At just 25, he'd already conquered Belgrade and captured the island fortress of Rhodes. His empire controlled 3 continents and ruled over 25 million people. This French alliance gave him the perfect excuse to do what he'd been itching to do anyway, march straight into the heart of Europe and expand his dominion even further. Now here's where it gets truly tragic. King Louis II of Hungary wasn't stupid. When he heard the Ottomans were coming, he sent urgent messages to every Christian power in Europe. Hey, a massive Muslim army is about to invade, a little help here. Surely, he thought, the great kingdoms of Christendom would rush to defend a fellow Christian nation, right? Wrong, dead wrong. England's Henry VII promised assistance that would arrive in 1527, a full year after the battle. Thanks for nothing, Henry. The Pope sent 50,000 gold coins, which sounds generous until you realize it was nowhere near enough to field an army. And Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor himself, the guy whose brother-in-law was Louis, radio silence. Austria's Archduke Ferdinand, also family by marriage, crickets. Europe's power players were too busy with their own squabbles and ambitions to care about Hungary's survival. Louis and his kingdom were completely, utterly alone. Here's the kicker, even if help had arrived, Hungary was already rotting from the inside out. 12 years earlier, in 1514, the kingdom had been torn apart by one of the bloodiest peasant revolts in European history. A man named György Dasa, a minor noble turned revolutionary firebrand, had led the common folk in a violent uprising against the aristocracy. The rebellion was crushed with absolutely brutal efficiency by the nobility, led by a guy named John Zapolian. But the damage was done. The aftermath was merciless. The peasants who might have defended Hungary from invasion were stripped of their weapons and reduced to the harshest forms of serfdom imaginable. Many of them now saw the approaching Ottoman army not as invaders, but as potential liberators from their own oppressive lords. Let that sink in. Hungarian peasants were more afraid of their own nobles than they were of a foreign conqueror. The nobility itself was fractured and paranoid, with regional warlords refusing to follow the commands of their young king. Personal rivalries trumped national survival. Hungary was a house divided, and it was about to fall spectacularly. Meanwhile, on April 23, 1526, Suleiman began his march westward from Belgrade. And when I say march, I mean he brought nearly 100,000 soldiers with him. This wasn't a raid or a scouting mission, this was the full weight of the Ottoman Empire unleashed for total conquest. The composition of Suleiman's army was revolutionary. At its core were professional soldiers, the elite janissaries serving as infantry and the Sipahi providing devastating cavalry power. These weren't part-time farmers called up for a season of fighting, they were career warriors whose entire existence revolved around war. The Janissaries were trained with firearms, making them arguably the world's first standing gunpowder infantry force. But the real nightmare for Hungary, the artillery. Suleiman brought 300 cannons. 300 cannons. To put that in perspective, Louis would eventually scrape together 85 artillery pieces, which sounds decent until you realize he was outgunned more than 3 to 1. The Ottomans had mastered something the Hungarians hadn't: combined arms warfare. Artillery would soften up enemy formations. Musket fire would tear apart charging cavalry. Disciplined infantry would hold the line while mobile forces swept around the flanks. This wasn't medieval warfare anymore. This was warfare as a science, conducted by professionals who'd perfected their craft through constant campaigning. As Suleiman's massive army rolled through the Balkans, cities had two choices: surrender and supply his forces, or resist and get wiped off the map. Most chose wisely. The Sultan wasn't just a warrior, he was a strategic genius who understood that wars are won through logistics, intelligence, and psychological warfare long before the first sword is drawn. So how did Hungary respond to this approaching apocalypse? With perhaps the most spectacularly bad series of decisions in military history. King Louis II, full of youthful courage and tragically short on experience, marched south from Buda with a pathetic force of just 4,000 men. His destination: the plains of Mohács, a name about to become synonymous with national catastrophe. Reinforcements trickled in: Germans, Poles, Bohemians, bringing the total force to maybe 25,000 men. On paper, not terrible. In reality, a disaster waiting to happen. These weren't disciplined professionals like Suleiman commanded. They were a hodgepodge of feudal levies, mercenaries of questionable loyalty, and nobles more concerned with personal glory than sound tactics. Now here's where it gets truly insane. The Hungarian War Council knew that additional reinforcements were on their way, 15,000 more troops that could significantly boost their chances. All they had to do was wait a few more days. They chose not to wait. Let me repeat that. Facing a vastly superior enemy with a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, the Hungarians decided to fight immediately rather than wait for desperately needed reinforcements. It's one of the most catastrophically stupid military decisions ever made, and it was about to cost them everything. The battlefield near Mohács was an open plain broken up by marshes and uneven ground, terrain that favored nobody, but especially not the kind of coordinated cavalry charge that was Hungary's main tactical advantage. It was as if they deliberately picked the worst possible place to make their stand. The Hungarian battle plan was simple: charge with heavy cavalry, break the Ottoman center, create chaos, win the day. It was a tactic that had worked brilliantly for centuries against medieval armies. Against Suleiman's gunpowder-equipped professionals, it was a suicide note. The Hungarian commanders simply didn't grasp the fundamental transformation that firearms had brought to warfare. They were clinging to the glorious past, while the future was marching toward them with cannons and muskets. Behind the lines, young King Louis embodied both the nobility and the tragic foolishness of his doomed army. At 20, he had courage in spades but wisdom in short supply. His nobles, fractured by rivalries and drunk on their own pride, had pressured him into this premature battle. Their arrogance was about to get them all killed. Meanwhile, Suleiman deployed his forces with clockwork precision. He'd personally led 13 military campaigns and spent over a decade in the field. His experience showed in every detail. The Ottoman battle line stretched across the plain like a steel trap, artillery positioned to create killing zones, janissaries arranged to deliver devastating volleys, cavalry ready to exploit any breakthrough or hunt down fleeing enemies. The technological difference between these two armies was staggering. While the Hungarians clung to medieval weapons and tactics, the Ottomans deployed innovations that would define warfare for centuries to come. The janissaries had perfected the kneeling firing position, allowing them to deliver continuous, accurate musket volleys at a rate European armies wouldn't match for decades. At Mohács, this remained an Ottoman secret weapon that would prove absolutely devastating. The Ottoman artillery wasn't just superior in numbers, it was better designed, longer ranged, and more effective. Ottoman engineers had turned individual cannons into components of a coordinated bombardment system that could shatter enemy formations before they even got close. As the two armies faced each other that August morning, the contrast was stark and heartbreaking. On one side stood the flower of Hungarian chivalry, brave men in gleaming armor who represented the dying embers of medieval warfare. Their banners fluttered, their lances gleamed, their horses stamped impatiently as they prepared for what they believed would be a glorious charge. On the other side waited the most advanced military machine in the world, professional soldiers with cutting-edge weapons and tactics. The janissaries stood in perfect ranks, muskets loaded and ready. Behind them, artillery crews made final adjustments to their guns. This wasn't just an army, it was a war machine designed to crush any opponent through superior firepower, coordination, and discipline. The stage was set for a massacre. The battle didn't start with the thunderous clash of legends. It started with an eerie stillness that seemed to stretch across the entire plain. August 29, 1526, 30,000 Hungarian souls stood in their final formation, armor glinting in the sunlight like scattered jewels against dark earth. 6 kilometers of riverside plain stretched before them, the Danube flowing silently to the east as if nature itself was holding its breath. King Louis sat on his warhorse at the center of his army, his young face set with determination that couldn't quite hide the gnawing uncertainty underneath. Around him, the cream of Hungarian nobility adjusted their armor and whispered prayers, their confidence built on centuries of military tradition. They'd beaten Ottoman raiders before. Surely this would be no different. To the south, beyond a gentle rise, Suleiman's vast host deployed with mechanical precision. The Sultan watched from his command position as regiments of janissaries formed deadly squares, their white felt caps bobbing like foam on a dark sea. Behind them, artillery crews worked with practiced efficiency, loading charges that would soon transform peaceful countryside into a hellscape of smoke and thunder. The Ottoman deployment was a masterclass in military organization. While the Hungarians relied on feudal levies and personal courage, Suleiman's army operated as a single organism. Each component had its role in a symphony of destruction about to unfold. Sipahi cavalry took position on the flanks, their colorful banners creating a rainbow of death. In the center, rank upon rank of janissaries prepared to show the world why they were considered the finest infantry on earth. The fateful moment arrived with casual inevitability. A Hungarian herald rode forward under a flag of truce, perhaps hoping for some last-minute negotiation. The gesture was noble but pointless. Suleiman hadn't marched across the Balkans with 100,000 men to engage in diplomatic chit-chat. He'd come to break Hungarian power once and for all. The herald returned, and King Louis gave the signal that would echo through history. Hungarian war horns sounded across the plain, their voices calling the knights to their final charge. 30,000 voices raised in a battle cry that had once terrified enemies across Europe. But the sound seemed to die in the thick air, swallowed by the vastness of the plain and the ominous silence from Ottoman lines. The Hungarian cavalry surged forward like a steel tide, hooves drumming against the earth in a rhythm that had decided countless medieval battles. From their perspective, it must have seemed glorious beyond words. The flower of Hungarian chivalry riding toward destiny with banners streaming and lances leveled, each knight convinced that divine providence and personal valor would carry the day. For a brief shining moment, the old ways seemed like they might actually triumph. The Hungarian charge struck the Ottoman vanguard with tremendous force. The leading enemy ranks wavered under the impact. Knights crashed into infantry formations, lances piercing mail and flesh, warhorses trampling fallen enemies beneath iron-shod hooves. The Hungarians pressed forward, sensing victory, driving deeper into Ottoman deployment. But Suleiman had anticipated exactly this moment. The Ottoman artillery, which had remained silent during the Hungarian advance, suddenly erupted in a coordinated bombardment that transformed the battlefield into a vision of hell itself. 300 cannons spoke as one, their voices merging into a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Stone balls and grapeshot tore through Hungarian ranks with indiscriminate fury, turning proud knights into broken corpses in the space of heartbeats. The janissaries added their own deadly contribution to the symphony of destruction. Rank after rank of musket-armed infantry delivered coordinated volleys that created walls of lead no cavalry charge could penetrate. The kneeling firing position the Ottomans had perfected allowed them to maintain continuous fire, one rank reloading while another delivered its volley. The Hungarian knights found themselves riding not into glory, but into a storm of metal that no amount of armor could deflect. The technological superiority of the Ottoman forces became devastatingly, horrifyingly apparent. While the Hungarians relied on individual prowess and the shock effect of massed cavalry, the Ottomans deployed coordinated firepower that turned warfare into a mathematical equation. Superior numbers plus superior technology plus superior coordination equaled inevitable victory, regardless of how much courage their enemies displayed. The Hungarian charge, which had begun with such magnificent promise, dissolved into chaos and carnage as Ottoman firepower took its toll. Knights tumbled from their saddles, their armor offering no protection against concentrated musket fire. Horses screamed and fell, creating obstacles that disrupted the formations behind them. What had been a coordinated assault became a desperate melee, as individual knights found themselves isolated and surrounded by enemies who fought with disciplined precision rather than individual heroism. King Louis himself was swept up in the carnage, his royal banner providing a rallying point for those Hungarian knights who still had their mounts and weapons. Around him, the remnants of his army fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they faced annihilation. But courage alone couldn't overcome the mathematical reality of the battlefield. The Ottomans had deployed superior numbers, superior weapons, and superior tactics, creating a killing field from which few would escape. The Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, held in reserve during the initial clash, now swept forward to complete the encirclement of Hungarian forces. These light horsemen, armed with bows and sabers, moved with fluid precision around the flanks of the disintegrating Hungarian army. Their role wasn't to break enemy formations through shock action, but to prevent escape and hunt down fleeing enemies. They executed this mission with the cold efficiency that characterized every aspect of Ottoman military organization. As the Hungarian army crumbled under the weight of superior firepower and coordination, Individual acts of heroism became meaningless against the inexorable logic of modern warfare. Knights who trained their entire lives for single combat found themselves facing enemies who fought as components of a larger machine. The personal relationships and feudal obligations that bound the Hungarian army together proved utterly inadequate against the professional discipline that unified their opponents. The battle that was supposed to save Hungarian independence instead became its funeral. In less than 2 hours, a kingdom that had endured for centuries was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing across the blood-soaked plain. The Battle of Mohács stands as one of history's most decisive turning points, a moment when the medieval world died in a storm of gunpowder and steel. In less than 120 minutes, Suleiman's military revolution shattered not just an army, but an entire way of life. The sleeping lion of Hungary would never again roar as a unified kingdom. Its territory was carved up between Ottoman, Habsburg, and Transylvanian masters for the next 200 years. Young King Louis, drowned beneath the weight of his own armor, became the perfect symbol of a feudal age crushed by modernity's relentless advance. Mohács proved that courage and honor, however noble, cannot stand against superior technology, professional discipline, and strategic genius. The hammer of the Ottomans had fallen, and with it, the fate of Central Europe was forever changed. The lion had fallen into an eternal sleep, never to wake again.